The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. People sat in silence, their eyes darting between the judge on the bench and the young woman standing before him. She was a black woman in her late 20s, dressed neatly but modestly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed a mix of fear and determination. She had been fighting a legal battle for months, and today was supposed to be the day justice was served. But as she stood there, she could feel the weight of the system pressing down on her. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a reputation for being harsh, leaned back in his chair. He looked down at her with a smirk, his tone dripping with condescension. "You really think you have a case here?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You people always think you're being treated unfairly, but maybe if you followed the rules, you wouldn't be in this situation." The woman's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She knew better than to argue with a judge, especially one like him. She had heard stories about this man, how he often mocked defendants, especially those who didn't look like him or come from the same background. But she hadn't expected it to be this blatant. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about standing up for what was right. The judge continued, his voice growing louder and more mocking. "You think the system is against you? Maybe it's just you. Ever think of that?" A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared to speak up. The woman's lawyer, a young man sitting beside her, clenched his fists under the table but remained silent. He knew challenging the judge would only make things worse. As the judge rambled on, the woman's mind raced. She thought about all the times she had been dismissed, ignored, or treated unfairly because of who she was. She thought about her family, her community, and all the people who had supported her through this ordeal. She couldn't let them down. She had to stay strong, no matter how hard it got. Just as the judge was about to deliver his ruling, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Everyone turned to see a group of federal agents walking in, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room fell silent, the tension now palpable. The judge stopped mid-sentence, his smirk fading as he watched the agents approach. One of the agents, a tall man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. The judge's face turned pale, his earlier confidence replaced by shock. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The agent didn't flinch. "You're under investigation for corruption, bribery, and abuse of power. We have evidence that you've been accepting bribes to influence your rulings." The judge's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around the room, as if searching for someone to help him, but everyone was too stunned to react. The woman standing before him couldn't believe what was happening. She had come to court expecting the worst, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. She watched as the agents handcuffed the judge and led him out of the courtroom, his head hanging low. The room was in chaos, people talking over each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As the commotion died down, the woman's lawyer turned to her, a look of relief on his face. "This changes everything," he said. "With the judge out of the picture, we can get a fair hearing." The woman nodded, but her mind was still reeling. She had seen firsthand how power could corrupt, but she had also seen that justice could prevail, even in the most unexpected ways. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the woman stayed behind for a moment, taking it all in. She knew this wasn't the end of her fight, but it was a step in the right direction. As she walked out of the courthouse, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead would still be tough, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. The news of the judge's arrest spread like wildfire. By the time the woman left the courthouse, reporters were already swarming the steps, microphones in hand, cameras flashing. She kept her head down, avoiding their questions as her lawyer guided her through the crowd. "No comment," he repeated firmly, shielding her from the chaos. She could hear snippets of their voices: corrupt judge arrested in court. What does this mean for ongoing cases? But she didn't stop to listen. Her mind was still processing everything that had happened. As they drove away from the courthouse, the woman stared out the window, the city streets blurring past. Her lawyer broke the silence. "This is huge," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The judge's arrest could completely change the outcome of your case. We'll need to file a motion for a retrial, and with the evidence of his corruption, there's no way they can ignore it." She nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about the legal technicalities or the next steps. She was thinking about the look on the judge's face as he was led away in handcuffs. It was a mix of shock, fear, and humiliation, the same emotions she had felt so many times before. When she got home, her family was waiting for her. They had seen the news and were eager to hear her side of the story. She sat down at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and told them everything. Her mother listened quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. "I knew you'd get through this," she said finally, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's hand. "But be careful. People in power don't like to be challenged." The woman knew her mother was right. The judge's arrest was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how deep the corruption ran. She had seen how the system worked, how it protected its own and punished those who dared to speak out. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The federal agent's intervention had shown her that there were still people willing to stand up for what was right. Over the next few days, the story dominated the news. The judge's arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond the courtroom. There were bribes, kickbacks, and backroom deals involving powerful people in the city. The public was outraged, and protests began to erupt outside the courthouse. People held signs demanding justice and accountability. The woman watched it all from a distance, feeling a strange mix of hope and unease. She had wanted justice, but she hadn't expected it to come like this. Meanwhile, her lawyer was working tirelessly to prepare for the retrial. He spent hours poring over documents, gathering evidence, and building their case. "We have a real shot now," he told her during one of their meetings. "The judge's corruption taints everything he touched. We just need to make sure the new judge sees that." She nodded, trying to stay focused, but the weight of it all was starting to wear on her. She had been fighting for so long, and the thought of starting over was exhausting. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, there was a knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of who it could be. Standing there was a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with a serious expression and a badge clipped to his belt. "I'm with the FBI," he said, holding up his identification. "I was hoping we could talk." She stepped aside, letting him in, her heart racing. What could the FBI want with her? The agent sat down on her couch, his demeanor calm but professional. "We're investigating the judge and his associates," he explained. "We believe you might have information that could help us." She frowned, confused. "What kind of information?" she asked. The agent leaned forward, his eyes steady. "We know you've been through a lot, and we know the system failed you. But if you're willing to help us, we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." She listened as the agent explained what they were looking for, any details about her interactions with the judge, any suspicious behavior she might have noticed, anything that could help them build their case. She thought back to all the times she had been in his courtroom, the way he had treated her and others like her. She had always assumed it was just how things were, but now she realized it was part of something much bigger. After the agent left, she sat in silence for a long time, thinking about what he had said. She had spent so much of her life trying to avoid trouble, trying to stay out of the way. But now, she had a chance to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. It was a scary thought, but it was also empowering. The next morning, she called her lawyer and told him about the FBI's visit. He listened carefully, then said, "This could be a game changer. If you're willing to cooperate, it could strengthen our case and help bring down the rest of the corrupt network." She took a deep breath, her mind made up. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll help them." As she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it. She had been pushed down too many times to count, but she was still standing. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for justice. The woman's decision to cooperate with the FBI marked the beginning of a new chapter in her fight for justice. Over the next few weeks, she met with investigators several times, recounting her experiences in the courtroom and providing whatever details she could remember. It wasn't easy. Reliving those moments brought back feelings of anger and frustration, but she pushed through, determined to see it through to the end. The FBI agents were thorough, asking detailed questions and taking notes as she spoke. They wanted to know everything: how the judge had treated her, whether she had noticed any unusual behavior, and if she had ever been pressured or threatened. She told them about the judge's mocking tone, his dismissive attitude, and the way he seemed to favor certain people in the courtroom. She also mentioned the rumors she had heard about him accepting bribes, though she had never seen proof herself. As the investigation progressed, more details began to emerge. The judge wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger network of corrupt officials, including lawyers, police officers, and even a few local politicians. The FBI had been tracking them for months, and the woman's case was just one piece of the puzzle. Her willingness to come forward gave them the leverage they needed to dig deeper. Meanwhile, her lawyer was busy preparing for the retrial. With the judge's arrest and the growing evidence of corruption, the case was gaining national attention. Media outlets were covering the story extensively, and public opinion was firmly on her side. People were outraged by the systemic injustice, and many saw her as a symbol of resistance against a broken system. It was a lot of pressure, but she tried to stay focused. She didn't want to be a symbol, she just wanted justice. One afternoon, her lawyer called with an update. "The retrial has been scheduled," he said. "And the new judge is someone with a solid reputation for fairness. This is our chance to set things right." She felt a flicker of hope but quickly reminded herself not to get too optimistic. She had been let down too many times before. As the days passed, the woman found herself caught between two worlds: the legal battle for her own case and the larger fight against corruption. The FBI kept her informed about their progress, and she was amazed by how much they had uncovered. They had evidence of bribes, falsified documents, and even threats made against witnesses. It was a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what she had imagined. But with progress came danger. One evening, as she was leaving her apartment, she noticed a car parked across the street. It had been there for hours, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She hurried back inside, her heart pounding. Was it her imagination, or was someone trying to intimidate her? She called the FBI agent she had been working with, and he assured her they would look into it. "You're doing important work," he said. "We'll make sure you're safe." Despite the risks, she refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. She continued to meet with investigators, attend court hearings, and speak out about her experiences. Her courage inspired others to come forward, and soon, more witnesses were sharing their stories. The case was no longer just about her, it was about exposing a system that had failed so many people. As the retrial date approached, the woman felt a mix of emotions. She was nervous, hopeful, and exhausted all at once. But she also felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about winning her case, it was about holding people accountable and making sure no one else had to go through what she had. The night before the retrial, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city lights outside her window. She thought about everything she had been through, the humiliation, the fear, the moments of doubt. But she also thought about the people who had supported her, the investigators who had believed in her, and the strangers who had rallied behind her cause. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that gave her strength. As she lay down to sleep, she whispered a quiet prayer. Not for victory, but for courage. Whatever happened in the courtroom tomorrow, she knew she had already won in one important way: she had refused to be silenced. The morning of the retrial dawned bright and clear, but the woman's nerves were anything but calm. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that felt professional yet unassuming. Her lawyer had advised her to appear confident but not confrontational. "Let the evidence speak for itself," he had said. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, and headed to the courthouse. The scene outside was chaotic. Reporters and camera crews lined the steps, shouting questions as she walked by. Supporters held signs with messages like, "Justice for all," and "End corruption now." She nodded politely but didn't stop to engage. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, eager to witness the proceedings. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. The new judge, a woman in her 50s with a calm demeanor, entered the room, and everyone rose. She took her seat and began reviewing the case files, her expression neutral. The woman felt a flicker of hope. This judge seemed different, focused, fair, and untainted by the scandal that had brought down her predecessor. The prosecution opened the case by outlining the corruption that had tainted the original trial. They presented evidence of the bribes, the backroom deals, and the judge's blatant bias. The woman listened intently, her heart pounding as they played recordings of conversations between the judge and his associates. It was surreal to hear his voice, so familiar and yet so different now that the truth had come to light. When it was her lawyer's turn to speak, he approached the bench with confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about more than just my client. It's about a system that has failed her and so many others. The corruption we've uncovered is a stain on this court, but today, we have an opportunity to begin cleaning it up." He presented their evidence, including documents and witness testimonies, and argued passionately for a fair verdict. The woman was called to the stand, and as she walked to the front of the room, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. She took a deep breath and swore to tell the truth. Her lawyer guided her through her testimony, asking her to recount her experiences in the original trial. She spoke clearly and calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. She described the judge's mocking tone, his dismissive attitude, and the way he had made her feel invisible. It was painful to relive those moments, but she pushed through, determined to make her voice heard. The defense tried to undermine her testimony, suggesting that she was exaggerating or misremembering events. But she held her ground, answering their questions with quiet confidence. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her, not this time. As the day wore on, more witnesses took the stand, each adding another piece to the puzzle. By the time the court adjourned for the day, it was clear that the case was far from over. But the woman felt a sense of relief. She had done her part. Now, it was up to the judge and the system to do theirs. As she left the courthouse, she was met with a mix of cheers and questions. She smiled faintly but kept walking, her mind already on what lay ahead. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right side of history. The second day of the retrial began with a sense of urgency. The courtroom was just as crowded as the day before, but the mood had shifted. The evidence presented so far had been damning, and it was clear that the prosecution was building a strong case. The woman sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, as the proceedings resumed. The prosecution called more witnesses to the stand, each one shedding light on the extent of the corruption. A former court clerk testified about seeing envelopes of cash being exchanged in the judge's chambers. A police officer admitted to being pressured to falsify reports in exchange for favors. The woman listened in stunned silence, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was hearing. It was one thing to know about the corruption in theory, but hearing it laid out so plainly was overwhelming. When the defense took their turn, they tried to downplay the significance of the evidence. They argued that the witnesses were unreliable, that the recordings could have been manipulated, and that the woman's case was being used as a distraction from the real issues. But their arguments felt weak, almost desperate. The new judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable, but it was clear she wasn't buying into their narrative. Midway through the day, the prosecution dropped a bombshell. They presented a document, a ledger detailing the bribes the judge had accepted over the years. The amounts were staggering, and the names listed included some of the most powerful people in the city. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and even the judge seemed taken aback. She called for a brief recess to review the document, and the tension in the room was palpable. During the break, the woman stepped outside to get some air. She leaned against the courthouse wall, her mind racing. The ledger was a game changer. It wasn't just about her case anymore, it was about exposing a system that had been rigged for years. She felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. The truth was finally coming out, and there was no going back. When the court reconvened, the judge addressed the room. "This is a serious matter," she said, her voice firm. "The evidence presented today raises significant concerns about the integrity of this court and the justice system as a whole. I will not allow this case to proceed without addressing these issues." She ordered an independent review of the ledger and called for additional investigations into the individuals named in it. The woman's lawyer leaned over and whispered, "This is huge. The judge is taking this seriously, and that's exactly what we needed." She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about all the people who had been wronged by the system, all the lives that had been ruined by greed and corruption. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about all of them. As the day came to a close, the woman felt a sense of cautious optimism. The retrial was far from over, but it felt like a turning point. The truth was out in the open, and there was no hiding from it. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, she felt like justice was within reach. As she left the courthouse, she was met with a crowd of supporters. They cheered and clapped, their faces filled with hope. She smiled faintly, acknowledging them with a nod, but her mind was already on what lay ahead. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready to see it through to the end. The revelations from the retrial sent shockwaves through the city. The ledger detailing bribes and corruption became front-page news, and public outrage grew by the day. Protests erupted outside government buildings, with people demanding accountability and reform. The woman's case, once a small, personal legal battle, had become a rallying cry for a movement much larger than herself. As the independent review of the ledger began, more names were added to the list of those under investigation. Lawyers, police officers, and even a few local politicians found themselves under scrutiny. The FBI expanded its operation, working around the clock to follow every lead. The woman watched it all unfold from a distance, still processing her role in the larger story. She had never set out to be a hero or a symbol, but now she found herself at the center of a fight for justice that extended far beyond her own case. Her lawyer kept her updated on the legal proceedings, but the retrial was temporarily put on hold as the investigations took priority. "This is bigger than us now," he told her during one of their meetings. "The system is being forced to confront its own flaws, and that's a good thing. But it also means we need to be patient." She nodded, understanding but still anxious for closure. In the meantime, she began receiving messages from strangers, letters, emails, and even phone calls from people who had been inspired by her courage. Some shared their own stories of injustice, while others simply thanked her for standing up to corruption. It was overwhelming but also deeply humbling. She realized that her fight had given others hope, and that was something she hadn't expected. One evening, as she sorted through another stack of letters, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a young woman standing there, looking nervous but determined. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, "but I just wanted to thank you in person. Because of what you did, I finally had the courage to come forward about what happened to me." She handed over a folder filled with documents, evidence of her own struggle against a corrupt official. The woman invited her inside, and they talked for hours. By the time the young woman left, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about creating a system where everyone could seek justice without fear. As the days turned into weeks, the investigations began to yield results. Several high-profile figures were arrested, and the public's demand for reform grew louder. The woman's lawyer called with an update: the retrial would resume soon, and the new judge was determined to see it through fairly. "This is our chance," he said. "The system is finally listening." The woman took a deep breath, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. She knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The ripple effect of her courage had sparked a wave of change, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The retrial resumed under a cloud of heightened anticipation. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers all eager to witness the next chapter of the unfolding drama. The woman took her seat, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. She had come too far to turn back now. The prosecution continued to present its case, methodically dismantling the defense's arguments. They called expert witnesses to analyze the ledger and confirm its authenticity. They presented phone records, emails, and financial documents that painted a clear picture of the corruption that had plagued the system. The evidence was overwhelming, and even the defense seemed to struggle to counter it. When it was the defense's turn, they tried to shift the focus back to the woman's original case, arguing that the corruption scandal was a distraction. "This trial is about whether my client is guilty or not," the defense attorney said, his voice rising in frustration. "Not about the actions of a judge who is no longer here." But the new judge wasn't having it. "This court will not ignore the context in which this case was originally tried," she said firmly. "The integrity of the justice system is at stake, and that cannot be overlooked." The woman was called back to the stand for cross-examination. The defense attorney tried to rattle her, asking pointed questions designed to undermine her credibility. But she held her ground, answering calmly and confidently. She had nothing to hide, and her honesty shone through. When the attorney finally sat down, frustrated, she felt a small but significant victory. As the trial progressed, the woman couldn't help but notice the growing tension in the room. The stakes were high, not just for her but for everyone involved. The corruption scandal had shaken the city to its core, and people were watching closely to see how the system would respond. Would it hold itself accountable, or would it continue to protect its own? During a recess, her lawyer pulled her aside. "You're doing great," he said. "But we need to be prepared for anything. The defense is desperate, and they might try something unexpected." She nodded, understanding but not letting fear take over. She had faced worse, and she wasn't going to let anything stop her now. When the trial resumed, the prosecution called a surprise witness, a former associate of the corrupt judge. The man, clearly nervous, took the stand and began to recount his involvement in the bribery scheme. He spoke of the pressure he had been under, the threats he had received, and the moral compromises he had made. His testimony was damning, and it left the courtroom in stunned silence. The woman listened, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. It was one thing to hear about corruption in the abstract, but hearing it described so vividly was another thing entirely. She thought about all the lives that had been affected, all the people who had been denied justice because of greed and power. It was overwhelming, but it also strengthened her resolve. This was why she was fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged. As the day came to a close, the judge announced that the trial would continue the following week. The woman left the courthouse feeling exhausted but determined. She knew the end was in sight, but she also knew the hardest part was yet to come. The final arguments would be made, and the verdict would be delivered. It was a daunting prospect, but she was ready. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about everything she had been through. The humiliation, the fear, the moments of doubt, they had all led her to this point. She had faced the system head-on, and in doing so, she had sparked a movement for change. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about creating a better future for everyone. As she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace. No matter what happened in the courtroom, she knew she had already won in one important way: she had refused to be silenced. And that was a victory worth fighting for. The final day of the retrial arrived, and the courtroom was electric with tension. The woman sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the prosecution and defense prepared to deliver their closing arguments. The weight of the past few months, the hearings, the testimonies, the revelations of corruption, hung heavily in the air. This was it. The moment she had been fighting for. The prosecution went first. The lead attorney stood and addressed the judge, his voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just one woman's fight for justice. It's about exposing a system that has failed its people. The evidence we've presented shows a clear pattern of corruption, bias, and abuse of power. The original trial was tainted by a judge who put his own interests above the law. But today, we have an opportunity to set things right." He walked the judge through the key pieces of evidence, the ledger, the witness testimonies, the recordings, and emphasized how they all pointed to a system that had been rigged against the woman from the start. She came to this court seeking justice, and instead, she was mocked, dismissed, and denied a fair hearing. But she didn't give up. She fought back, and in doing so, she exposed the truth. Now, it's up to this court to deliver the justice she deserves. The woman listened, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. The attorney's words echoed her own feelings, and for the first time, she felt like someone truly understood what she had been through. When it was the defense's turn, their attorney stood and tried to shift the focus back to the original charges. "Your Honor, while the prosecution has presented a compelling narrative about corruption, it's important to remember that this case is about whether my client is guilty or not. The actions of a judge, however reprehensible, do not change the facts of the case. We ask that you base your decision solely on the evidence presented and not be swayed by the larger context." The woman's lawyer leaned over and whispered, "They're trying to downplay the corruption. Don't let it get to you." She nodded, but her stomach churned. The defense's argument felt like a desperate attempt to ignore the bigger picture, and it frustrated her. This wasn't just about her case, it was about holding the system accountable. After the defense finished, the judge called for a brief recess to review the arguments. The woman stepped outside to get some air, her mind racing. She knew the judge's decision would have far-reaching implications, not just for her but for the entire city. If the judge ruled in her favor, it would send a powerful message that corruption would not be tolerated. But if the judge sided with the defense, it would feel like a betrayal, a reminder that the system was still broken. When the court reconvened, the judge addressed the room. "This has been a complex and challenging case," she began, her voice calm but firm. "The evidence presented has raised serious concerns about the integrity of the justice system, and those concerns cannot be ignored. However, my role is to evaluate the facts of this case and deliver a verdict based on the law." The woman held her breath as the judge continued. "After careful consideration, I have determined that the original trial was indeed tainted by corruption and bias. As a result, I am overturning the previous verdict and dismissing the charges against the defendant." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The woman felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a flood of emotions, joy, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of vindication. She had fought for so long, and finally, justice had been served. But the judge wasn't finished. This case has exposed deep flaws in our system, and it is my hope that it will serve as a catalyst for change. Corruption has no place in our courts, and those responsible must be held accountable. I will be recommending a full review of all cases handled by the previous judge, as well as reforms to ensure this never happens again. As the judge adjourned the court, the woman's lawyer turned to her with a smile. "We did it," he said. "You did it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. It was over. She was free. But as she left the courthouse, she knew her fight wasn't really over. The system was still broken, and there was still work to be done. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to celebrate. She had stood up to corruption, and she had won. And that was something no one could ever take away from her. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The woman's victory made headlines across the country, and she was hailed as a symbol of courage and resilience. But while the world celebrated her win, she found herself grappling with what came next. The fight had consumed her life for so long that she wasn't sure how to move forward. Her lawyer helped her navigate the aftermath, connecting her with advocacy groups and legal organizations that were working to reform the justice system. "Your story has inspired a lot of people," he told her. "You have a platform now, and you can use it to make a real difference." She nodded, but the idea of stepping into the spotlight was daunting. She had never sought attention, she had only wanted justice. As the weeks passed, she began to find her footing. She started speaking at community events, sharing her story and calling for accountability. Her words resonated with people who had felt powerless against the system, and she quickly became a voice for the voiceless. It wasn't easy, there were moments of doubt and fear, but she reminded herself why she was doing it. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about creating a better future for everyone. Meanwhile, the investigations into the corruption scandal continued to yield results. More officials were arrested, and reforms were implemented to prevent similar abuses of power. The woman watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and relief. She had played a part in bringing about change, and that was something she could be proud of. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a young man standing there, looking nervous but determined. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "Because of what you did, I finally had the courage to come forward about what happened to me." He handed her a letter, his hands trembling slightly. She invited him in, and they talked for hours. By the time he left, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she had fought so hard, to give others the courage to stand up for themselves. As the months passed, the woman began to rebuild her life. She found a new job, reconnected with old friends, and even started volunteering at a local legal aid clinic. It wasn't always easy, there were still moments of fear and uncertainty, but she was determined to move forward. She had faced the worst the system could throw at her, and she had come out stronger on the other side. 1 year after the verdict, she was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. Standing on the stage, looking out at the crowd, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. "This fight isn't over," she said, her voice steady and strong. "But every time we stand up for what's right, we move one step closer to a system that works for everyone. I didn't set out to be a hero, but I learned that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about standing up even when you're afraid. And if I can do it, so can you." The audience erupted in applause, and as she stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of closure. The past was behind her, and the future was full of possibilities. She had fought for justice, and in doing so, she had found her voice. And that was something no one could ever take away from her. As she left the conference, she looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was ready to face them. She had been through the fire, and she had come out stronger. And now, she was ready to begin again.